Okay, I never think I have anything important enough to say to be amplified, but we do have people online, so we will do that. Thank you all for being here. My name is Bo Adams. I have the great privilege of serving as director of Pitts Theology Library. It's wonderful to see some old friends here and some new friends. The real star of the evening is later, and our presentation later, but you guys are the early folks, and so I don't want to miss the opportunity of a captive audience to brag a bit on the Kessler Collection and the work that my colleagues and I have been doing over the last year or so. It's been a while since we've gotten the gang all together, and if you're a regular attendee, you may know that spring is an odd time for the Kessler Collection gathering. We tend to gather in the fall around Reformation Day, and we have the awesome opportunity that this year, Reformation Day will fall on October 31st, so we can actually officially celebrate Reformation Day on that Thursday. Am I doing something wrong? My colleague Brady. Turn me down, thank you. Speaking of my colleague Brady, I want to thank some of my colleagues, Dee Roberts, you see in the back taking pictures. You've met my colleague Liz Miller earlier, Brady Beard, Armin Sedletsky, the whole Pitt staff that does an amazing job of all of the work that we're going to talk about today, but also the behind the scenes work that makes some of our presentation and public events work so well. So what today is I said, a bit off cycle for us in terms of presenting the work that the Kessler Collection has been doing. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is we did not meet last fall, and there are a couple of reasons for that. One is we had this amazing new Morgan collection that I'll talk about in a second that we celebrated in the fall, and the school had to go through this little thing called reaccreditation, which any of you have been through that know that is a year's worth of work in about a week, and that the reaccreditation visit fell exactly during Reformation Day. They clearly were not aware of the liturgical calendar. The good news is, I think I can say the school has been reaccredited, so this is, it all worked out. But the real reason we're here is we had the amazing opportunity of Professor Andrew Pettigrew joining us, and this worked out for his schedule and our schedule, and so I'm so excited to have him here. We will talk a lot more about him later and hear from him and learn quite a bit from him. But I do want to let you know that Reformation Day in October will be back on, and so we will resume regular scheduled programming in October with the Kessler Reformation Day. You may have seen that our table outside, we still use the tablecloth of Reformation Day at Emory. I hope that didn't cause any great confusion. What I want to do today is continue a tradition that my former colleague, Pat Graham, who is here, started, which was to use an opportunity like this to highlight some of the new acquisitions that we have had the great privilege of working with this past year. On the one hand, that is, of course, to show off some neat stuff. But on the other hand, it is to give the community some sense of what we're doing with the great resources that we are privileged to be stewards of. We are a library, of course, and so that means we collect old things. But I think we would fail in our duty if all we did was collect old things. And so I hope what you will see through some of my remarks today is that we are quite committed to doing things with the old things. And those are both scholarly endeavors as well as public engagement. And it is the great privilege of my job that I have colleagues who allow us to do this. And so I want to spend some time giving you a little sense of what we've been up to, and then maybe close with some thoughts, pontifications, and really questions for you about what does it mean to do this work in an increasingly digital age. I think all of us recognize that the old way of library may be under pressure or under change. And my colleagues and I are keenly aware of that. And so while we try to honor what we've done in the past and continue to build great collections like this, try to think about them a little bit differently and what becomes possible in the new digital age. So if everyone's agreeable with that as a kind of general orientation, I'll talk for a little while, hopefully not too long. Then we'll retire to Emory's Canon Chapel, where we will hear from Dr. Pettigrew, and then we'll have a reception following. So let's just talk about what the Richard C. Kessler Reformation Collection is. This was started in 1987 with donations of materials by Richard and Martha Kessler, who are Lutheran lay people and great friends of the Lutheran Church and of Pitts Theology Library. And their donations, combined with books already held by Pitts Theology Library, formed the early seed of what we now call the Richard C. Kessler Reformation Collection. I always like to show this graph because I find it quite remarkable. This is just charting the annual acquisitions of the collection since the early 90s. You can see the inception was actually 1987. So you see we started pretty healthy, but you can see tremendous steady growth. And that really points to two things. One is amazing resources that have been provided by our supporters and donors. and then great stewardship of a collection. My former colleague, Channing Jeske, my former colleague, Pat Graham, and all those who have had hands in building the Richard C. Kessler Reformation Collection. Key to the success, I believe, has been focus, right? Lots of libraries collect lots of things, but we with the Kessler Collection have defined a fairly tailored collection development policy and really tried to stick to that. And I'll talk in a little bit about how that's sometimes challenging, but I think that is the reason that you've had the success here, because you've had a donor base and a supporter base that is on board with what we're trying to do, and we've tried to stay true to that. Now, you may remember that we had a fun opportunity a couple of years ago to celebrate the 4,000th item in the collection. So we started with less than 1,000 and we built over to 4,000. And we had a fun fundraising campaign and raised quite a significant amount of money for us to make a real landmark acquisition for that 4,000th item. Doesn't look that exciting, but this is what it was. This is a 1517 publication from Wittenberg that was in some ways Luther's very first publication. So likely issued in March or April of 1517, preceding the October 95 Theses. It is his translation and notes on the 7 penitential Psalms. And I always like to point out, it has the L-U-D-R spelling of Luther's name, which was common at the time and before the L-U-T-H-E-R that we know. And as we often do with new acquisitions like this, we try to engage scholarly activity to celebrate these acquisitions. And our good friend, Timothy Wingert, who many of you may know was here last fall, wrote a wonderful article in Lutheran Quarterly, kind of marking the significance of this acquisition and what it tells us about kind of early Luther theology, if we want to call it that. Now, as I mentioned, the Kessler Collection has built a really significant holdings of materials that we tend to date between 1501 and 1570 in roughly defined German-speaking territories at the time, focused around Luther and the conversations that Luther started. And as I always like to say, outside of Germany, you may not find a better collection focused on Luther. Now, Dr. Pettigrew may disagree with me and we can have some arguments, but the point is we've done a really good job. Now, we're never going to compete with some of the great libraries across the world, and that's okay, because from the beginning, the Kessler Reformation Collection has not just been about building a collection. That is, it's not just about having books on the 4th floor above us. Our goal has been to be the premier Reformation collection because of engagement with the collection. That is to find opportunities for people to learn from these materials. And this 4,000th acquisition was, for many of us who work with the collection, a real kind of so what moment. We've done it. We collected 4,000 items. So what? Where are we going to move forward with that? And I've spent the last few weeks kind of thinking about this, and I encourage you to look at Reformation Notes, which is our kind of annual description of what's going on. You have a copy with you that we provided. This was the original Reformation Notes. You can see fall 1992. And while I would argue that our graphic design has gotten slightly better, no offense to Pat and some of the work that was done here, it's a fun read to see that since the beginning, since the early 90s, we've really been focused on how to get people engaged. You can see that the concert, there used to be a big Reformation Day concert going on. And so again, an attempt to use the collection to teach people. Throughout the years, we've had some of the leading Reformation scholars here in person. Some of you may recognize some of Emery's own, Timothy Albrecht and John Whitty. But just a kind of slideshow in my mind of some who's who. Nick Wilding here, yet again, he came back. Yeah, thanks, Nick. And so Reformation Day has been a great way to bring scholars, and I always choose scholars, hat tip to the two that are here today, who are great scholars, of course, but can speak to a public audience. And that's really important to us, and that is to kind of make the connection between why this old stuff in a contemporary context. So we've been very proud of the scholars that we've brought in. We've been very proud. I've pulled some of these old photos. Pat, we got some bearded Pat photos here, I think. But then there's Channing right there. Yeah, Channing Jeske right there. To bring people in to really have a kind of hands-on approach with the collection. And some might say that we're a little cavalier with our materials and leaving them out with people, but we think it's important that people engage with this materials. There's the Ingalls, some newer photographs there. We have a very active K-12 program. So on many days when you come here in the library, it's a lot louder because there are a lot of kids running around. And so my colleagues, you can see, for example, my colleague Brandon Wasson up here has refurbished an old printing press. So we get the kids involved in the process of making books. Again, as a way for kids to have a touch point with, why do I care about these old pamphlets or things like that? The collection has also been engaged in scholarship. So we always herald and promote scholarship that is coming out of the collection. So these are just some examples of recent articles and publications that have been based on items from the Kessler collection. So with all of this, I just want you to recognize that we are not content with just building collections, though we've been very successful with that, but we always have an eye toward engagement. So what I want to do, as we do every year, is to show you a few of the things that we have added to the collection in the last year. Now, continuing to build this collection within what is a fairly narrow collection development policy and a collection that is already 4,000 items gets more and more difficult every year, and it's a great problem to have. My colleague Armin and I spend a lot of time leafing through auction catalogs and booksellers' offerings, often to be disappointed with that exciting thing we were ready to buy that we already have that probably particular edition of the work. So again, a very wonderful problem to encounter. And people often ask me, how do you decide what it is that you're going to buy? And of course, we're often at the mercy of the very inefficient book market, right? We decide to buy what is offered for sale oftentimes. But we do, of course, keep in our back pocket a list of kind of the wish list items. And we're slowly ticking off that list and making our way, acquiring the things that we feel that a library and a collection of this stature should have. So I'm proud to share with you one particular item that we added this year that had been long on our list, and that is in the gallery today, and that is the German Nuremberg Chronicle. You see the title page of it here. If you go to our Instagram feed, you won't be able to see this because we're not connected with the internet right now. We had a fun unboxing video where it came in this Nuremberg Chronicle came in this box that was larger than I was, and we got to unpack it and kind of reveal it on Instagram. It was some of my colleagues a little more whimsical and fun than I am, and so they had a good time with that. So if you're not familiar, I encourage you to see it in the gallery. We have our German copy, the Nuremberg Chronicle 1493 publication, originally a Latin work that was translated in the same year into German. The print run of the German edition was a little bit smaller, and therefore it tends to be a little bit more rare, but we had the great privilege of borrowing Emery's Rose Library's copy of the Latin. So we had the Latin and German displayed right along one of them. The Nuremberg Chronicle is essentially a history of the world up until that point, divided into various ages of history. As you might imagine, it is largely a kind of biblical history telling of the world, famous for its many woodcut images, over 1,800 images. Really only about 645 unique woodcuts, but a lot of those people get reused over and over again. So the same biblical figure can look like someone you've already seen before in the book. It's a large folio book. It's over 18 inches tall, and it's printed on imperial paper, which was the largest standard paper size at the time. And you see it has some wonderful, wonderful images. It's famous for these large cityscapes that it has. So here's Nuremberg, which is right in the center of the book when you open it up. Here is the kind of seventh day of creation. It walks through the various days of creation, depicts them as such. Here is Christ enthroned, surrounded by the apostles. Here is one of its famous kind of genealogies or depictions of the descendants of Noah, these kind of wonderful graphic depictions. Again, these are the kind of people that will appear later in the show as the same image. So this is, again, an example of one of those things that we have been looking for many, many years. And to be candid, looking for one that we could afford over many, many years. And we had the great fortune of it coming to us this year. So we're excited to show that in the gallery. This past year has also been an amazing year for Bibles within the Kessler collection. Of the 4,000 or so items in the collection, about a quarter of the Kessler collection consists of biblical texts or commentaries or sermons explicitly on scriptural texts. And the collection, of course, contains some of the most significant Bibles of the early print period, including Luther's September Testament, his first translation of the Greek New Testament into German, 1522. It includes all 5 editions of the Greek New Testament edited by Erasmus during his lifetime. The first 2 editions of the Rabbinic Bible, 1517 and 1524, the Complutensian Polyglot, and so on. So we already start in a pretty good place with Bibles. But one growth area for the collection has been German translations of scripture other than Luther, that is, before Luther. And this year we landed a really nice one here. I think I have it, yeah, so it's this book here. So before Luther's translation of 1522, there were a number, up to maybe 17 or 18 translations of scripture. Of course, German translations of the Latin Vulgate. Luther goes back to the Greek and to the Hebrew. And they're important not only for understanding the Bible and how it was interpreted at the time, but also for understanding the varied German language that was kind of evolving in the late 15th and early 16th century. So an exciting acquisition this year was this 1516 German Gospels and Epistles with glosses, printed in Hagenau by Thomas Anselm, which you see here. It includes these wonderfully hand-colored images you see here on the title page. Then as you flip through, you see stories. So here, Jesus pointing to the signs from Luke 21. You have the young Jesus, the beardless Jesus, right, teaching with the scholars in the temple. You have Jesus with the Canaanite woman. So all these wonderful rich woodcut images that have been hand-colored by an early owner of the book. This book is also, I think, interesting because it was previously owned by the 19th century Bavarian printer Karl Haag, who I have to say has one of the all-time Wikipedia pictures of all time. There's our boy Karl. Really fantastic. So I like to think I'm sitting down with Karl and reading this book with him. So that's the 1516 German translation of the Gospels and Epistles. A second Bible acquisition from this past fall is a Luther translation. In fact, as I noted earlier, Luther's 1522 translation of the New Testament from Greek. His Old Testament, translated from Hebrew, took significantly longer. He published the Pentateuch the next year, 1523, printed by Melchior Lotter, also in Wittenberg, a work that the collection does hold. But it would not be until 1534 that Luther would issue the full translation of the Bible into German, printed by Hans Luft in Wittenberg, a book we don't own quite yet. That's another one on the list. In between, though, he issued portions of the Old Testament in translation, including what we have here, which is this, here, which is the 1524. So 1523 was the first Pentateuch, 1524 translations of Genesis through Song of Solomon. The edition, as you'll see, and I hope you'll come up and see it, is beautifully bound in blind-tooled pigskin and includes really some magnificent woodcut images preceding each section of the translation. So here is the beginning of the Bible. Here is the depiction of Joshua here. And then my favorite is the crucifixion scene here. This woodcut done by master of all masters, Albrecht Dürer, and is thought to be perhaps the only Dürer woodcut that actually appears in a biblical text. I like this image too because we always play the fun game with Dürer of like, where is the cool Dürer signature? If you may know, he has a very neat AD. So this is another Dürer woodcut that we have. It's actually in the gallery of the Martyrdom of St. Catherine. You can see down here, this is his little cool stylized AD. So let me go back and see if you can find it in here. Not a great impression, so you may have a little bit of struggle. We sent this out on the library Slack channel and nobody could actually find it. So no, it's all the way down at the bottom. You see it now? There it is right there. Yeah. Yeah. So Albrecht was here, I guess is what it says. Yeah. So just a couple of Bibles that I hope you'll come up and see. But beyond Bibles, one of the foci recently in the Kessler collection has been works that define the context for the Reformation. So what was going on in these territories leading up to Luther? And again, this year we added a really significant work that helps us understand a major influence on Luther and his companions. It's a collection of sermons by Johann Geiler von Kaiserberg, printed by Knobloch in Strasbourg in 1511. So Geiler was one of the best known preachers of his day. Long before the great preacher of Luther and his contemporaries, there'd been a bit of a resurgence of preaching in the Middle Ages. And the one David Steinmetz has called, quote, Prince of the Pulpit in the late 15th and early 16th centuries was Johann Geiler. Brandon Wasson and I always talk about this idea of the like celebrity preacher has been with us for many, many, many centuries. It's always kind of been a thing. He was, for 32 years, the people's priest in Strasbourg. And I think like a lot of celebrity preachers then and now, the consistent theme in his preaching was moral improvement amongst the clergy, the laity. The world's gone to heck, right? We got to really pick things up here. Interestingly, his preaching, of course, was for the people, in contrast to some of his contemporaries. And though he would write his manuscript sermons in Latin, he would preach them in the people's German. And the edition we have here is clearly a writing down of his sermon as it was received and heard As Steinmetz notes of Geiler's approach, quote, "The preacher cannot be an instrument of reform if he restricts himself to the delivery of learned and, from the standpoint of the common people at least, generally incomprehensible essays in Latin." So again, this sounds like something we might attribute to the reformers of maybe a decade later, but this was something that was already going on. Geiler himself, trained as a Catholic priest, was a strong internal critic of the church, and is sometimes credited for laying the groundwork for the reception of some of Luther's reforms, particularly in Strasbourg, which of course Geiler did not live to see. The collection now has a total of 5 of his works, and this newest edition has 6 of the sermons together. It's called the Book of the Pomegranate, drawing on the name from one of his sermon images. This particular copy is bound in blind-tooled calfskin with a 14th century manuscript on the end papers, which is quite lovely and beautiful. What I love about this book, beyond the sermons, is that it includes 6 woodcuts by Hans Baldwin Green, who was one of the master artists at the time. You can see, for example, here Martha and Mary and Lazarus. You can see St. Elizabeth sewing for the poor. And then my absolute favorite here. Anybody know this scene? We always tell the students, the guy with the horns, right? Who's the guy with the horn? Moses, right? Standing over the Red Sea with the vanquished Pharaoh's army right here. Fantastic image that I hope you'll come and check out. This book also has really interesting provenance, where it bears the book plate of, you see here, Gilbert R. Redgrave, 1844 to 1941, well-known British architect and book collector who has annotated, as you can see, this work extensively. He served as president of the Bibliographical Society from 1907 to 1988. Then it was through the society that he became involved in a project to produce an authoritative list and brief description or short title catalog of all English books published before 1640, which eventually came out in 1926 and is often referred to by the names of its 2 principal authors, Pollard and Redgrave. So continuing the theme context for the Reformation and what I find to be interesting imagery, we also recently added an apocalyptic work by Joseph Grunpeck, who lived 1473 to 1532, printed by George Stooks in Nuremberg in 1508. So here is an image from that work. The Kessler copy up here is bound in a 15th century antiphonal vellum manuscript leaf. Grunpeck was professor of rhetoric in Ingolstadt. He later became the secretary and chaplain to Emperor Maximilian I. He's a really fascinating guy who works not only on theological issues, but also on science and medicine, including some important early 16th century works on infectious diseases. He actually got a bunch of infectious diseases and then decided, I need to write about this stuff so we can figure out what's going on. Later in life, he wrote a number of prophetic and rather dark works, including this one, where among other things, he predicts the collapse of the church and society in general. This genre of dire prophecy was popular and profitable at the time, and several of the works like this ended up on the Council of Trent's Index of Banned Books. You can probably see why from some of the images. Here you see the church running over people, the house on fire here, the church burning down and being destroyed. The work that accompanies these images is Grunpeck's kind of lamentation of the violence and breakdown in order of society that he thought was characteristic of his time. I suspect this may be something that some of us can relate to. I try not to psychoanalyze myself when we were making these acquisitions about why I thought this might be appropriate to get at the time. But I do, and I put this in here, it's a little ridiculous. I think of this as the 16th century equivalent of the famous meme from Casey Green that you probably see on the internet. I find some comfort in knowing that we who lament that the world is burning and on fire have some companions from 500 or so years ago. So anyway, wonderful Kessler items that you will come up, I hope you will come up here and see. But I also want to spend a moment to talk about what I call Kessler ancillary work, because despite that the Kessler collection really constitutes about 2.5% of our rare book. So it's numerically not a big portion of what we collect, but it has kind of a lot of inertia for the work that we do for a whole number of reasons. And so what I mean is that we always keep our eye on the Kessler collection when we are collecting outside of the Kessler collection, with thought that there will be connections for research, for exhibitions, for presentations, these kinds of things. So I wanted for a minute to take a few examples of things that we've successfully acquired over the last year outside of the Kessler collection, just to give you a sense of how that works. The first example is this book here, which is from our incunable collection, and just a fancy word for books published kind of in the 15th century in Europe. This is, and I should say, I'm really kind of proud of the fact that over the last 6 years, we have grown the incunable collection by 20%. It did not start huge, but it has started to get big. And for those of you in book collecting know, these books are expensive and not easy to acquire. So it's been quite a thing for us to do. This here is the title page of a 1489 Latin Vulgate printed by Johann Preuss in Strasbourg. And the Bible itself, and I hope you'll come look through it, is you know, it looks like a lot of incunable Bibles and is rather nondescript, but we are quite interested in it because of this. Now you can see the inscription on the title page here, so I'll zoom back out so you can see, where you can see that it says 1489, which is the indication of the date that the book was published. And then it says, note that Martin Luther was born in 1483. And in 1518, he apostatized or committed apostasy. And then he died in Eisleben in 1546. So this is quite a kind of curious thing here for a couple of reasons. First, 1518 as the date of apostasy is interesting, right? So if we might think that the 95 Theses were posted in 1517, though I think that's a date that probably started being celebrated much later as a kind of marking of the beginning of the Reformation. Luther was officially excommunicated by Rome in January of 1521. The Leipzig disputation between Luther and the Eck was held in 1519. Leo X's papal bull condemning Luther was 1520. 1518, while certainly a significant year in Luther's developing fight with the church, was still really a time of negotiation marked by his meeting with Cajetan. Perhaps 1518 is significant because it's the year that Luther publishes his sermon against indulgences. But I'd be very interested, and I look to you gentlemen here, as to why 1518. It seems a little bit strange to me. But also, it's just kind of odd to have this inscription on the title page of a 1489 Bible. What is he trying to tell us here, right? Is he a fan of Luther? Probably not. He calls him an apostate. But why is he taking his Bible to mark these dates? Now, Professor McFarland, who I trust with all things, came up here and suggests that he's marking here that all the way back in 1489, we were doing biblical stuff that Luther may take credit for. Am I capturing your? Yeah. So we had already done all this, or this stuff was already happening way back in 1489. But just kind of a curious thing. So again, when we look at books and we see Luther's name, that tends to jumps out, and we put it alongside the Kessler collection. So we're excited to kind of play around with this a little bit more. We also collect 16th century items that may not fit strictly within the Kessler collection, but help us understand the reforms of Luther in their context and their impact within the broader church. And one of these is perhaps my absolute favorite acquisition of the past year. It's back in the gallery, so I don't have it here, but it really has been the one book that I've been searching for since I've worked at Pitts Theology Library. So if you look at this Bible here, this Latin Vulgate, you'll notice that there are no verse numbers in the text, of course. Printers of Bibles in the 15th and early 16th centuries had no standard way of indicating sections of the text. Chapter numbers had been around for a while. And though they had a system of using marginal letters to indicate blocks of text, and if you see this kind of chapter number mixed with A, B, C marking blocks of text, people are able to make rough kind of cross references and these kinds of things. But as greater focus fell to the interpretation of Scripture and the translation of Scripture, people are starting to compare versions, as was common in the 16th century. You might imagine how maddening that would be if you don't have precise indications of particular parts of the text, right? If we're trying to compare a Latin verb and I'm like, look over in section B, and people are like, what are you talking about, section B? It becomes really quite challenging. And so, as you will see in the back of the gallery, this created the necessity for a technological innovation that we know as verse numbers. So the gentleman that, of course, gets credited with this is Robert Etienne, a Latin name Stephanus, who was the prolific Parisian printer in the middle of the 16th century. Etienne is very much a favorite here at Pitts, and many of his editions of both the Church Fathers and of the biblical text are key parts of our collections. including his famous so-called royal edition of the Greek New Testament, printed in 1550. This was the first real critical edition of the New Testament to be printed, where Etienne had developed a system of indicating where different manuscripts differed in their readings of the Greek text. Now, this particular Bible, the 1550, sparked great madness amongst the Parisian theologians at the Sorbonne, and Etienne fled Paris that year in 1550, running to safe harbor in Geneva, where he continued his printing career after that. And it was there in Geneva in 1551 that he issued the Greek New Testament. That was his fourth Greek New Testament that he had done. That is the prize acquisition that I'm so proud of, because this is the first New Testament that has the verse numbers that we are familiar with. Now, you'll see in the back of the gallery, there had been earlier Bibles that had numbered verses, but for whatever reason, their innovation didn't catch on. But Etienne hit it at the right moment, and therefore he was the one that gets credit for this. You can see there's the title page here, and here's it's a very tight binding, so the photographs are really challenging. But you can see it's a 3-column text where you can see E. So this is Erasmus's Latin translation. This is that critical text, the 1550 Greek text that Etienne put together. And then he has the Vulgate here running on the inner column. So you can compare them. And then you can see the verse numbers that are appeared here. Now, what I love about this book is, so he's run out of Paris in 1550, runs to Geneva, and in 1552 publishes his reply to the Parisian theologians. And because he's developed his verse number system, he's able to go verse by verse and point out to them all of the places where he's right and they are wrong. There's also, of course, the famous story about how he ended up putting the verses where they are. 1594, his son produces a concordance and tells this story in the intro to the concordance, where he says famously that his father did the verse numbers inter equitandum, right, while on horseback. And so, the joke goes that as the horse went up and down, so the pen went up and down and marked the places of the verses. There are some weird places where verses break. Most likely it means between his horseback rides, he would take his time and write his verse number system. But anyway, this is a very exciting discovery that we were privileged to take advantage of. And so I hope you will go see it back in the gallery. One last Bible that I want to point out to you that doesn't fit anywhere within the Kessler collection, but I think shows how the influence the Kessler collection has. Many of you may have known that we recently launched last year the J. Michael Morgan English Bible and Psalmody collection, which was the result of our great friend Michael Morgan. Here he is attending Reformation Day in 2018 or something like that. Michael, who was a local musician who had amassed one of America's great private collections of English Bibles, sadly passed away on Christmas Day of 2022 and donated his entire collection to us, some 5,600 volumes dating from some of the most significant English Bibles of the 16th century all the way through contemporary publications. And we've had great fun combining the Morgan collection and the Kessler collection together and thinking about how these two can draw on one another. And I want to just give you one example of that. And it's this book that I have over here. Oh, these are a couple of examples from Michael's collection. This is a wonderful one. So he was a big Isaac Watts fan. So this is one of Watts' early metrical psalters, where he's inscribed it to a Mrs. Hartop, who was the first person to give Watts a job when he was looking for a job. So just kind of lovely connections that Michael had put together. But this is an interesting acquisition that we made within the Morgan collection in the last year. So this is a 1776 Sauer Bible. It's often called the Gunwad Bible. I'll talk in a second about why it's called that. Christopher Sauer, who was in Germantown right outside of Philadelphia, was a German Lutheran printer who was printing texts, including Bibles, for the Lutheran community there. Starting in 1743, he printed what was the first Bible printed in a European language in the American colonies. And this is the 1776, so the third edition. And as I said, it's referred to as the Gunwad Bible. So why do you ask, I assume you ask, right? So the original print run was said to have been 3,000 copies. But as I mentioned, this is 1776. You might remember what was going on in America. And so, yeah. And so in 1777, he had his print stock that he had printed, but he was quite fearful that Germantown was going to be overrun by the British troops, which in fact it was. And so he relocated to Philadelphia. And he took his print industry with him, but he left, so the story goes, this stock of Bibles here. And of course, the British soldiers took over Germantown, took over his stock, and allegedly ripped up his Bibles and used it as cartridge paper for their muskets. About half of the stock was said to be true. Now, whether this is actually true, who knows, but it makes for a great story for gun wad Bibles. So I've run through a number of acquisitions here, and I wanted to just kind of, and I'll invite you up here in a second, but let me pause here and ask if there are any questions, thoughts, concerns about the materials we're buying. I don't care what your concerns are. No, I'm just kidding you. I have more to say, but I just want to see if there's any other questions. Very good. Okay. So the first point here with summary of acquisitions is we continue to add to this incredible collection. And the chart that I showed you, we're going to keep building that, and it's going to keep going up. But the second point, and here's where he hits you with the solicitation. One way to support the collection is through donations through our acquisitions budget. I'm going to talk about another way. It's not the only way. But the only reason we've been successful is the continued support of many of you in this room and many of those who have great interest and great passion for the work that we're doing. And if you've been involved in rare books in the last few years, you know that rare books have gotten a lot more expensive and a lot more challenging to acquire, particularly for institutions, right? Against another institution, I can do fairly well. Against a private collector who's a billionaire, I have a little more challenge in making acquisitions. So we are grateful and always looking for more support to allow us to continue to add incredible collections like this. Now, finally, and I know that's the dangerous thing for the preacher to say because everyone tunes out at that point, but I do want to close by assuring you that our continued collecting of old works in a digital age is ongoing and will continue, though it will happen in a modified format. And so one of the things my colleagues and I have been thinking about since the pandemic, of course, is what do we do in this new world? Because it is certainly a new world. And a couple of the answers to that might be quite obvious. There's the Gunwad Bible. We digitize collections, right? And for the last few years, we have been on a very aggressive path to digitize some of the most important works in the Kessler collection. This is our digital collection site that we launched several years ago, where you can see that a lot of the Kessler items are discoverable and able to zoom in and see all of those kinds of things, which is wonderful. So you can go and print off an indulgence for yourself if you would like. In addition to our own digital repository, we also publish the Kessler collection into Emory's digital repository. So a bigger repository of more Emory works that duplicate or at least use the work that we've already done to make this stuff discoverable. But as I'm sure Professor Pettigrew and others will say, it's not enough to simply have your stuff in your little website, right? No one's going to find my stuff by going to the Emory website. And so increasingly partnership and growth in discoverability, putting our stuff out there with other sites has been a real priority for us. An example here is VD16, which is a German database of books published in the 16th century. A couple of years ago, we became an official contributor to VD16. So you can see, for example, here is a bibliographic record of a particular work. And then you can look down here, it shows the holdings, right? And so you see Pitts Theology Library right here. And then what's even most important, when you click on an example from Pitts Theology Library, you can click on that and lo and behold, it will take you directly to our copy of that work. So again, partnering with institutions like this that have broad reach and broad appeal and are able to present to the world a kind of unified catalog of all the books that are not only known, but also have been digitized has been a real priority for us. We have the expert here, Dr. Pettigrew, of course, who runs the Universal Short Title Catalog, which I suspect he will tell you a little bit more about later. But they are also a new partner for us, that is to publish our bibliographic records so that those who are searching in these broad databases can find our materials and can find the digitized versions of this. So this has been a really important outreach piece for us to get our materials out there. Second is we launched right before the pandemic a fellowship program. And like a lot of things, it got messed up by the pandemic. So our idea was to create virtual fellowships. We didn't want people to come and be in residence for a full year, but we wanted people, through the magic of the internet, to be able to work with our collections and produce good quality scholarship based on our collections. So we started in 2018-19 with a gentleman that several of you are familiar with, Ulrich Bubenheimer, who actually came here and was in residence for about 8 weeks, but conducted most of his research virtually. The following year, we invited 3 young scholars to be our Kessler Fellows, one of whom here is Dr. Pettigrew's students, who each were able to curate digital exhibitions and do digital work from afar. The goal is to have them come to the library twice a year, but as you might imagine, 2019 and early 2020, that got messed up really easily. And so, to be candid, we've stalled on this. And so we're excited to relaunch the Kessler Fellowship Program starting in the fall of 2024, another way to kind of broaden engagement with our collection. We've also launched through the pandemic a virtual engagement way, and I hope many of you participated in our Kessler Conversations. I'm really proud of this amazing group of scholars who have participated in this. So it is, we would do 3 a semester, and we've taken a year hiatus for all of the reasons I mentioned earlier. But they're hour-long conversations with scholars about a particular topic, and the topic comes not from the 16th century, but from the 21st century. So for example, we began, of course, with plague. What was plague like in the 16th century, and how can that help us understand what's going on with public health today? So again, taking our programming that's typically in person and expanding it through the power of the internet has been a really wonderful way. You can see these conversations. Look, there's me, and you and Cameron, who was at Columbia. And then we have also done virtual and online teaching. So this is a course that I taught in the fall at a local church. It was a 6-week course that was both in person, but also, look at me, there were recordings online where, again, we're able to take materials, like you see some here, and both show the materials to those who are in person, but also to live stream and broadcast these teaching opportunities all around the world. So in closing, I want you to recognize that things are certainly changing with the way that we do business around here at Pitts. The acquisitions are going to continue in strong, but we are always thinking creatively about how we can broaden that engagement and broaden that reach. Again, the growth's going to keep happening, but it's going to be happening in quite a different way. So let me just stop here. I am finally going to stop talking. And look, it's 5:15, which is exactly when I said I would stop talking. And pause if there are any questions. I invite you to come up here and get a hands-on approach with the books. And then we will retire around the corner up to Cannon Chapel, where we will hear from Dr. Pettigrew. Thank you.